Welcome to Unit 7 of Software Quality Assurance, Software Testing Tools. In this unit, we'll be talking about testing automation. So, a couple different types of testing automation. The first type is called a capture replay testing tool. And we'll be doing a little bit of this with Selenium in the lab for this unit. And this allows you to work with an application that you're testing, and you can essentially record your actions and record your inputs and test the outputs to make sure that things are correct. So you can do your manual tests, but essentially record those actions, and then you can replay those tests over and over again as much as you would like. And so that can be a way to automate your regression tests. So once an application changes, you can record your tests and then just run them again every time that application changes and make sure that the application still runs correctly. Another type of tool is called a test case builder tool, and in this case, instead of recording your actions, you can essentially record your actions with code. So this is using computer code to specify actions that the test scripts should run. And test scripts it's computer code, so it's just like any other computer application. And if you have a large number of test scripts, it means you have a large amount of computer code, and you have to think about that. You might have as much code as you do in your normal application. So if you've got a lot of computer code, you need to have a testing framework in place for your code that does the tests. That was the point of doing tests, is we're testing computer code. But now if our tests themselves have computer code, we have to test the test to verify the tests are correct. So if you get a large amount of computer code, you have to manage it just like you would a normal computer application. And then talk about this more in a little bit too, but anytime you've got any sort of automation, it's going to have to change whenever your application changes. The first thing to talk about with automation is test data. And this is probably true really of any sort of testing, not just automated tests, where you're going to need some data to run your tests against. So your testing will be done in a testing environment, and you'll have your test system will have to access some sort of database, just like it would in production. So you need to have some sort of test data to run your application against. Now, even if you're doing ad hoc testing, where you're going in there yourself and running the program and testing various functions, you probably still need test data. So for instance, if you are testing an e-commerce site, you need to have the product information loaded. So what products are in this e-commerce site? What are the shipping options? What are the price levels? What are the different categories? So even if you're just testing yourself, okay, can I add something to a cart? Can I update the sales tax and shipping? There's still a lot of data you need in order to do those types of tests. And especially if you're doing automated tests that don't have any human involvement, you need all that data that needs to be in the database. So the next section here, we'll talk about the different ways we can get that test data. And then the last point here under the first category is, if this is a large system, this could be a lot of records. This could be thousands or even millions, billions of records. And so this is a kind of a big deal, especially with a large system. Where can we get appropriate test data? So there's the book talks about 4 different strategies for getting test data. So the first strategy that is used is to sample data from production. So this works if the system is already live. So you've already got a production system and you're maybe making changes to it, which is why you're testing. So if you've already got a production database, you can take a sample of that data. Now typically you don't take the entire production database, because that can be itself millions or billions of records. So we're looking at taking a small subset of that production data. Some advantage of this: the data is real, it's not contrived. A lot of times I've run into this in the business world. When we're testing with maybe made-up names and made-up data. So I've seen cases where we've tested with names like John Smith or Susan Sample was a popular one. They tend up being kind of short. And then I've seen the case where we've tested systems, everything works out fine, but as soon as you throw production data through it, turns out, oh, maybe we didn't have the columns in the database long enough because we weren't expecting that many characters in a name or something like that. And so your testing is really only as good as your data, and using real data is beneficial because you can test some of those cases that maybe you hadn't thought of. So special characters that might appear in the data, lengths of fields, and that sort of thing. Also, another advantage of using production data is it already exists, so you don't have to generate it. It's already there, so that can cut down on the time needed to get your test sets. So some disadvantages. It's hard to take subsets of multiple tables. So when we talk about taking a subset of production data, well, sometimes the first reaction say, well, maybe I'll just take 10%. So maybe there's 20 tables in this database. I'll just take the top 10% of the records in each table, and I'll transfer them over into a test system. But the trouble is that all those database records, as you know from database class, they're all linked, and there's relationships between those tables. So all the records you're taking from one table probably need to have relationships to other records in the other tables. And if you're taking the top 10% of each table, you may not be getting the right records for those subsets. So to give you an example, maybe in a shipping table, you're taking the top 10% shipping rates, and in the state table for the United States, you're taking the top 10% of the states. Well, maybe some of those shipping rates apply to states that are not, that you didn't take, and so you've lost that link now. Same thing with account records and transaction records. So if you're looking at your transactions of sales, maybe you sold 10 products in a certain day, and you took those 10 products for your test data. But those products don't point to accounts that you took in your accounts from your accounts table. So in all the data that you're taking, you have to make sure that all those links stay maintained. And that can be difficult then. It can be tricky to try to get the right records when you're taking a subset of the data. Another thing you still need to do, if you're using production data, is the point of using the data is that you are trying to use it for testing. And so if you just take, say the 10% of the records or something like that, those records may not meet the conditions that you need to test. So maybe you need to have a name that's a certain number of characters long, or maybe you need to have a certain number of items in an order, or maybe you need to have an order from a certain state. And so just blindly taking 10% of the records, maybe you're not getting the test conditions that you need. So once you get the records, then you still have to go through them and figure, okay, do I have records here that meet my test conditions? And then, of course, this doesn't work if you don't have a production database. So if this is a brand new system, you may not have access to production data. So this strategy would not be an option for you. So on the extreme other end of the spectrum, then would be starting from scratch, and this, which you might have to do if you've got a brand new system. You would create all the test data by hand, and so you would actually go in there and in the database and type out the data that you want to use for testing, or generate it by using your system or something like that. So one advantage of this is that you've got control over that data. So okay, I need records that meet this and this and this and this and this condition. Then you can create those records that meet those conditions. So it's easy to make sure that you've got records that meet all your testing conditions. Disadvantage of this is that you have to go in and make all the records by hand. So that takes a lot of time. And especially, it takes some thought behind it. So it does take time to generate all these records. System generated data is harder to duplicate. So a lot of systems, especially if you need to communicate with other systems, are generating files, generating system logs. That can be hard to type out by hand, and you probably don't want to type that out by hand. So that can be hard to hand generate those types of things. And then, as we mentioned, in this case, then if you're generating all the test data by hand, then your data is going to be contrived, and it may not be contain all the different things that might actually happen in a production system. And so I said in that previous example that we've had that problem in the business world. I've worked for a company where all our test names are short, and then our program failed in production because we didn't have those real-world names that were actually longer than what we were testing against. So that's a disadvantage for starting from scratch. So the next kind then is a hybrid approach. So combining those first two strategies. You can have, it's called seeding the data. So you've got production data. You can have a certain number of records that you pulled from production, but then you can go in and you can modify those records or add in your own records that you've written by hand to meet certain testing conditions. And probably that's usually what happens. I mean, it's probably typical, even if you take production data, that you still need to go in and you need to massage that a little bit by hand. And same thing, it's pretty hard to generate all your test data by hand, especially if you need a ton of records. And so maybe you'll do some of that, but then you'll try to pull production data for the rest of it. And then fourth approach is generating data. So one thing you can do if you've got a new system, so you don't have your own production data, is there are programs out there that can generate data for you. So you can say, okay, I need 1,000 records that meet these conditions. So I need first name, last name, a city, state, zip code, gender. You can say what you need, and there's programs out there that can generate data that meets those conditions. So that can be another option too. So those are kind of the four main ways that you can generate test data. And you need to generate test data. So somehow you need to have data in your database in order to do testing. So you'd be using one of these four approaches. So some things to think about, regardless of the strategy you use, is the timeliness. This is a real sticking point. So a lot of database records have a timestamp on them. Okay, when was this order placed? Or when is this order supposed to be shipped? When was the last login of the user? And whether or not these are dates and times that the user is seen, or just timestamps on the records that's just used internally in the database. A lot of records have some sort of date or time on them. And sometimes that can be okay, but sometimes that cannot be okay when you're trying to, when that data gets stale and when that data gets old and you're trying to test your system. So for instance, if you're trying to test users within a certain age, and you store their birth date and they get older as the years go on, or if you've got reports, a lot of times maybe it's pretty standard that you would send out invoices for people who have current accounts, people who are 30 days past due, 60 days, 90 days, and so on. Well, if that's all based on a timestamp, that means every time you test, every month when you're testing, your data is getting older. And eventually, all your test data is going to be 90 plus days past due, and there's not going to be anybody who's current. So that can really affect your test, and you won't be able to test unless you do something in that case. And so a lot of times you have to either figure out what's easier. Is it easier to change those timestamps, or is it easier to generate new test data? But somehow you'll have to solve that problem. And then, as we mentioned, anytime that application changes, then you're going to, you might need to be, well, here is talking about test scripts, but our subject is test data. You might need to be changing your test data when the application changes. So, for instance, maybe you're only shipping to certain states, or maybe there's new states because now you've added Puerto Rico or American Samoa or something like that. So you need to be changing your test data as your application changes as well. Okay, so the first part is talking about data, and then now we're going to talk about using test automation. And I mentioned in the lab of this unit, the lab walks you through, there's a video and some tutorials online of how to use Selenium, which is an application that allows you to record tests and code tests of a web application. So you'll walk through that and you'll actually be able to record your own tests. So I'll give an example of test automation. So we'll talk about now, when would you not want to use test automation? So first of all, when do you use test automation? So hopefully it's apparent that test automation is desirable. So you spend a lot of time testing, especially with a large application. You spend hours and hours and hours of testing. So if you are doing all your testing by hand, and you've got a formal test plan, but you're just doing it all by hand, it's taking a lot of time for testers to do that. In particular, we talked about if you're in an agile environment, or if your application is changing frequently, you're going to have to keep running tests over and over again. And there might be, especially for regression tests, so you might be testing a certain part of the application by hand to verify that it was done correctly, but now you still need to do your regression test, which means test everything else in the application that did not change, just to make sure that everything else still works. Well, that's a great place for automation, is maybe you would still test by hand in whatever the specific component is that you're testing that changed, but then your regression tests, maybe you don't want to sit there yourself and just retest everything that you already retested last week, just to make sure that nothing changed. So that'd be a great place to do automation. And boy, if you aren't doing any automation, you could probably fantasize about just, well, it'd be nice if I could just click a button, run some automated tests, and just go home, let it run overnight, and come back in the morning and look at the report, and not me sit here and just do all this testing by hand, especially if I already did it last week. So definitely there's a need for automation. There's a desirability of automation. But we're going to talk about some trouble we can get to with test automation. So it's the first bullet point. So it can take a lot of resources to do automation. So a lot of automation, at least the real dynamic high power automation, is coding. And so you are writing a computer program to do that testing for you. Well, when you're writing computer code, that you need a developer to write computer code a lot of times. And if your testing team may not have those development skills, if the person had the development skills, they would probably be a developer instead of a tester. So your testing team may not have that those skills necessary, and it can take a lot of time. It's not necessarily trivial. So the resources, both in time and training to do that testing, might be it is going to be a lot. And so really you'd only want to use automation if you're going to be using this program a lot, doing a lot of testing, and maybe for a long period of time. Second bullet point, so I skipped ahead to that one. So the testers may not have the skills necessary to set up these automated tests. And when the application changes, you need to change your test scripts too to reflect those changes. So it may not be appropriate then if you're in a situation where the application is changing a lot, because then you have to fix all your test scripts. So, but we just talked about that, especially in an agile environment, this would be a good place for automation, so you can run regression tests. But what we're saying here is you may not want to set up a certain part of your program for automation until it's fairly solid and not fluid. So if you're going to be working on this, so you're going to be working on a particular component for the next 3 months, well, you're not going to want to set up that component for automation, because it's going to be changing every week as developers are developing it. But after that 3 months, then maybe it's going to be fairly solid while developers are working on another part of the program. So then that would be a candidate for automation. So you only want to start automating a piece if it's fairly well developed and isn't going to be changing a lot. So I mean, all components are going to change at some point, but you don't want to set up automation when you're just starting development on a particular element, because you're going to have to change that automation every time that element is changed. So some reasons why automated testing doesn't end up working in the real world. A lot of times, so unrealistic expectations. I've seen this, and perhaps you have as well. A tech department oftentimes is pretty up on technology and enjoys things that are cutting edge. And sometimes we expect too much from things that are new. Sometimes we expect too much from technology. So if we have a lot of issues with our testing and things aren't going right, it's not like automation is just going to magically fix that. Automation can help with the amount of time it takes to run things, but automation can't help with bad test cases, bad user requirements, bad data. So sometimes it's common in the business world. We think, well, if we just throw more technology at this problem, all our lives will be better. Everything will be great. But that's not necessarily the case. So automation will only help you speed up your testing process, but it's not going to help you fix other issues. So going along with that, then you have to have some sort of formal testing process, and we've talked about that in the previous units in this course. So you need to have that testing process in place. If you don't have that in place, then there's really nothing to automate. So you need to have the procedures in place first, and then automation simply automates what's already there. False sense of security. So sometimes we think that we rely on the computer too much and say, okay, if this automation it's been working for 3 months, and so we're just going to depend on it. We're not going to do any manual testing at all. And if it passes these test cases, then we know it's good. But as we talked about, applications change, test data changes, and so we can't just depend on the automation. We need to be checking it, and we need to, just like if we were doing manual testing, we need to make sure we're using good test data and that we've updated our tests for the application. So for instance, in that example I talked about, maybe with invoicing, maybe after a year, all of our client records now are 90 plus days past due. But we're still depending on that for testing all our different components. So we're testing for people who have current accounts, people who are 30 days past due, 60 days past due, and so on. Well, if our records in our database got old and they're all 90 plus days past due, our other tests might still work. So our tests for current accounts might come back saying, yep, everything works. There are no bad records here. Well, there aren't any records there. So again, just because it's automated, we can't just blindly click the button. We need to make sure we're keeping an eye on what is going on and what is going on in our data. Technical difficulties, like anything, it can really work slick and it can save you hours and days of time for testing. But like anything, it might not work, and so it takes some work to set up. It might not go right. It's software itself. It might have bugs, so it can speed up your testing time, or it can cause you more problems. And so, with any technology, sometimes there can be difficulties. Organizational issues. So this may not apply only to automation, but you're going to need test data, and you're going to have to rely on other departments probably to help you with that. You might be able to generate some on your own, but probably, so I'm speaking from, like, pretend that you are the tester, or you are the business analyst. You may not know the data yourself, and so you might have to rely on other departments to help you with that. And so that dependency may cause some issues. You may not be able to get that, or you may not be able to get it in a timely manner. Cost. So like any tool, there is a cost associated with automated testing. It's software that you have to purchase, or there is freeware available, but a lot of the big ones, there's a cost associated with them. Or even if there's a cost to purchase the software, there's a cost for paying people to get up to speed on it. And so your testers will have to go to training or to learn on their own via the internet. So there is a cost, at least to get people up to speed the first time. The culture, and this probably applies to any technology in the business world, but what is your testing team like? And so is there buy-in with the testing team? So is this something that your testing team wants to do, to use automation? If they don't, then you're trying to force automation onto people who don't want to use it, and it's probably going to be a failure. There's probably going to be pushback. And so it just really depends on the culture of the testing team, if this is something that they're interested in doing or not. Some things we can't automate. So usability is a good example of something that's difficult to automate. It's hard to automate how usable an application is. So is it intuitive? Can a human figure out what they're doing and where they're going in your application? So it's hard to have a computer test something that is subjective to a human. So you're always going to have some sort of manual testing. One-time testing. So if you are only going to be testing once, then there's really no point in automating. Even if you'll only be testing twice, if you're going to take the time and energy to set up automation, you want to make sure that you're going to be running these tests for a long time so you get the benefit of the work you put in. We have I think I mentioned earlier, we have a consulting company in Duluth here that does a lot of, they develop a lot of software and do a lot of testing, and they mentioned this as well. So with a consulting company, they're developing the product and then they're delivering it to the client. They may not be the ones maintaining it. So perhaps the client has a maintenance team that will be maintaining the application. They didn't have the bandwidth to create the application themselves, but once it's created, they can maintain it. So for that consulting company, there's not really a reason to set up automation, because they're not the ones that are going to be using this program in the future and maintaining it and making changes. So the people developing it may not be the ones that would be interested in automated testing if they're not the ones maintaining it. Time crunch. So like anything, your project is going to be on a schedule. and it takes time to set up these automated tests. Obviously, the hope is that it saves you time in the long run, but there may not be time budgeted in for each phase to get that set up. So it depends on that. A lot of times you have to have that conscious time built into the project in order to be able to set up automated testing. So ad hoc testing, and we mentioned this, I think, on the previous slide too, that if there is no formal testing plan, if there is no formal testing process, then you can't automate that. So technology by itself doesn't solve anything. The technology can only automate what you've already got. So you still need to have that formal testing plan. And perhaps you're familiar with this. I've seen this. This is true for any technology, and I've seen this when we're developing applications for users. The users want maybe a new application because they're having problems. Well, the problems oftentimes stem from a lack of a process. So applications can help you automate an existing process, but they can't solve a problem that isn't already in some sort of process. Predictable results. So automation only works if it's clear the computer can put in this input and get this output, that we can determine by the output if the answer was correct or not. So they work in highly structured environments where data is clearly defined, but there are environments where it's unpredictable and you need a human to determine, okay, was this a correct result or wasn't it? And then we've talked about a couple of times now instability. If your system changes a lot, then it's just going to be too much coding and time to keep that automation up to date. Every time that system changes, then you're going to have to go in and try to fix your scripts to do that. So, okay, so that concludes the video for Unit 7. So this is going from the book's content. Do have one article out there in Blackboard to read about some generic types of testing, and then there is a lab out there as well using Selenium. And I think you'll see that it's pretty cool to do some of this automated testing, and it's pretty neat to be able to automate your steps through a web page. So that is it for Unit 7.